Don't know what we have, don't know what we're getting. Won't know
Yes.
that tomorrow. We'll know that the next day. Getting back to Foresight, Foresight Labs and Foresight Capital Management. We've had this discussion around the importance of the sort of tech core of companies that you're interested in and funding and Zera. What else? What other criteria do you apply? And you can answer this from either perspective, as a capital management company or the Foresight Labs perspective. What other criteria do you apply uh, to the determination of companies, modalities, technologies that you're interested in investing in? Is it modality specific? Is it indication specific? Are there geographic sort of guidelines? Just give us some sense for the MO there in terms of your investment criteria.
So it depends on the kind of company, and the criteria for company creation and investing in companies, they overlap, but the emphasis is different. So one thing I think that distinguishes our practice at Foresight Capital, and it's something that the founder of our firm and my colleague Jim Tannenbaum, has emphasized from the beginning, long before I was here, is measurable product quality. And so, for example, we have a very robust therapeutics team led by Michael Rome and Dorothy Margolski, and they are among the world's experts at evaluating the quality of a product as it's nearing a clinical experiment, predicting how will it work, seeing all of the dimensions from the molecular to the clinical to even the commercial, connecting those to understand, is this a product which will fundamentally benefit patients? And are there any barriers to its adoption? So that product orientation, which is in the firm since its founding, infuses even some of the more long-range speculative things that we create and we do, including big idea companies like Zera. Because in the end, there's this foundation of accountability to the patient, which is driven by knowing exactly what criteria you have to satisfy for a drug to be good. So we've never lost touch with that. And that definitely animates everything that we do, even in the big ideas that you wouldn't think are grounded in that kind of product logic, but increasingly they are.
Yeah. Regarding the point I made earlier about the cottage industry of companies that are coming, biotech companies that are coming up with an AI ML bend, or AI ML companies who are attempting to break into, as even as a service, right? Like service providers who want to serve biotech companies that are
Yes.
doing molecular discovery, target identification, design. How do you see that shaking out? It's a big, broad question, and maybe it's early to say, but and I ask this question like fully aware of the juxtaposition of $1 billion investment in a company like Zera, right? You've got Zera, you've got the Recursions of the world. You've got these,
Yes.
big giants right now, big players in the space, but then you've got this sea of small players who are trying to get a piece of the pie. What do you see happening there?
So it's tough to say, but we could again discuss some general principles and make some guesses. So one thing that Chris Gibson, and of course now Najat Khan is there as well. One thing that all of us agree on is the need for companies like this to generate data in their domains. Daphne Kohler would also agree with that, right? These are almost founding principles behind those three companies that I would highlight as really principled in their approaches: Recursion, In Citro, and now Zera. And I know that sounds either silly or obvious depending on your perspective, but actually there's a misunderstanding about the amount of biological data available and the importance of such data in training models to answer questions that are actually relevant for product development. And let's look at some examples. In the technology world, the reason that models of larger and larger scale can be trained is because there is a amount of data available that continues to grow. It may be plateauing now, but it has continued to grow in the past. And that's because as consumers using devices like this, whether we want to or not, we generate data, which is then harnessed for the next generation of models, whether those are new model architectures or they're just larger models using existing architectures that are working. There's actually no emergent or discontinuous behavior there. Their properties and their internal training metrics are essentially continuous properties of the amount of data and the size of the model.
Yeah.
In biology, we do not have data of that scale. In the places that we do, take the PDB, the Protein Data Bank, this is a database that has atomistic accuracy, right? Which is really unusual. And it's been curated by 4 or 5 generations of scientists literally since the mid 1950s. So that's a very unusual data set in its accuracy, breadth, historical completeness. There's very, very few data sets like that. So one of the reasons that we're just scratching the surface in biological machine learning and things like, on the other hand, solving the protein structure problem or creating approaches to design proteins, there's a gulf between those two, is the quality of data available. So our thesis and many others is that you actually have to create those data. The world is not creating them. Pharma companies are not creating them, maybe with the exception of Aviv Regev and her collaboration with Recursion.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's creating those data at a scale that's needed to train biological models that would actually answer useful questions. So what's an example of a useful question, just to be really concrete about this? So, in human genetics, we use to establish causal relationships between targets of drugs and disease. And we can do that because genetics are kind of like a randomized control trial, or the closest thing that we have to that, in that genetic variation is random between 2 individuals. So you can look at many, many millions of people, ideally, and you can see what these random experiments of nature are doing to their disease risk or to biomarkers in their body that are associated with disease. And because that's kind of random, like a randomized controlled trials, it allows you to make statements about causality, rather than just association. So it's incredibly powerful. But evolution selects against deleterious things. And so it's also quite limited, even in the limit where we have now, a couple million individuals' data available in one form of genetics or the other, we're still highly data limited. So one question is, how can we discover new targets without observing them in human beings? And that requires that we ideally do a lot of experiments where we introduce perturbations, experimental changes, pings into cells, into animals, into model systems, and put them all together. These are things that we can't observe in nature. They're too rare. And understand how does that relate to the human experience of disease. So that's kind of a grand challenge of machine learning, for which the data are so limited that it's only been possible to solve in narrow corner cases. One of the things that Zera is doing is creating more data of that kind in a single quarter than the whole world has created so far. And we think that experiments of that scale are necessary. The world isn't going to produce the equivalent of the Protein Data Bank on its own in the short term. So what does that mean? It means that these companies that have SaaS type business models, or business models where they're not generating data, but they're working on models, they have to stay ahead of all of the model generation activity in academia, which is very hard. There's a lot of creativity there. And they have to somehow access these data sets. If the data sets come into existence, they come into the public domain, or they'll be able to access it, and they can stay ahead of the academic community, then perhaps they could generate a lot of value, actually. If they don't, then it will be companies like Zera who are trying to generate data and harness the value of actually developing products that succeed. And my prediction is, in the steady state, all kinds of companies will exist because there'll be a lot more public data. There'll be many, many models and more people who are able to really generate specialized model architectures for particular problems. And there'll be many companies like Zera, which are harnessing all of this infrastructure for product development. In the short term, our bet is that the data generators are most likely to succeed because the data simply don't exist. I'd point to, even in the technology LLM space, there are companies that are worth many billions of dollars whose sole purpose is to organize the data that's freely available on the internet and make it available to those companies that are training large models. So even there, it's not as easy as I was suggesting. In biology, it's exceedingly hard. In clinical medicine, it's even harder. So that's why we think data generation is a prerequisite for all of this to be useful.
Yeah. Give us a sense for the execution of data generation. Give us an idea how that happens. Like,
well, I mean, there's generally 2 or 3 models. So one is this PDB type model, where there are individual investigators or large institutions that are generating data, and they pool it in databases for the good of the public. You've seen many projects like that in oncology, for example. You've seen many, the Cancer Genome Atlas, the DepMap project, the CCLE before that, all at the Broad. In single cell biology, there's been similar projects to create a single cell atlas. That's a project that Aviv Regev and Sarah Teichmann started and ran. CZI has made major contributions to that. So that's one model where consortium of academics over a decade generate a lot of data, or over many decades, and they pool it. So another model is the model of nation states producing large cohort data. And that's happened in the UK. I'm on the board of Genomics England, for example, and the UK remains, believe it or not, the world's largest data generating entity. Most of the useful biomolecular data that we use comes from the UK, not from the United States, because there's a rich tradition of that. And variants of that include companies like Regeneron or Amgen, which have sponsored very large projects to generate those data, over which for a short time they may have exclusivity, but eventually it ends up in the public domain. And then there's a third and emerging category of companies that are generating their own data and meaningfully sized data sets. That's happened in genetics, 23andMe, Ancestry, Decode Genetics, Kari Stephenson's effort in Iceland. But there's very few examples of that. And there's even fewer examples of companies that have generated large-scale laboratory data to train machine learning models. But there are a few, including in sitro, Recursion, and Genentech now, and Zera. So that's generally 3 ways that data get generated. I think the last one is going to be very important, in the next 5 years.